During this year's legislative session, one of the most frequently uttered four-letter words is one I can say: vote, used as a noun, verb, and adjective. Now that the session has concluded, another, only slightly more vulgar four-letter word has come to the fore. It's veto, which, if you think about it, is a natural successor to vote. After all, you can't spell veto without vote, or vice versa. Hi, I'm John Schwannis, and on this, our final show of the 2024 season, we'll look at the public policy battles that begin anew once legislation is sent to the governor's desk. Get that soap ready to wash out our mouths. It's Indiana Lawmakers, from the Statehouse to your house. At first blush, the veto might seem like a pretty straightforward policy tool. The governor doesn't like a measure that lawmakers have adopted, and poof, with the stroke of a pen, he or she makes it disappear. Well, that's true to an extent, but you have to remember that Indiana's veto process is different from most of its counterparts across the country. Now, all 50 governors have some sort of veto power. In some states, though, governors can exercise a so-called pocket veto and effectively kill a bill by doing nothing. In Indiana, if the governor does nothing within 7 days, the measure becomes law anyway. Aside from calendar considerations, vetoes can take several different forms. In many states, governors have the ability to issue a line item veto, that is, strike a general provision from a piece of legislation. Governors with reduction authority can delete a particular budget item, and those with amendatory authority can revise various sections of the measure. Indiana is one of just 7 states that limit their chief executives to 2 basic options: take it or leave it. What really distinguishes Indiana, however, is the relative fragility of the gubernatorial veto. In most states, a veto remains in effect unless 2/3 of lawmakers vote to override it. In Indiana, in contrast, a veto can be cast aside by a constitutional majority. That's just 26 votes in the Senate and 51 in the House. In the parlance of political science, Indiana's veto power is weak. In recent days, Republican Eric Holcomb issued the 8th and final veto of his 2-term tenure in the governor's office. House Enrolled Act 1002 was a compromise measure intended to define and proscribe anti-Semitism in Indiana schools. In vetoing it, Holcomb said the legislation contained confusing language that could inadvertently expose Jewish students to discrimination and harassment. 4 of Holcomb's 7 previous vetoes were overridden, but none of those bills had reached the governor's desk with the near unanimous support enjoyed by House Bill 1002. Well, we've closed the book, turned off the lights, and reached the end of the road. The buzzer has sounded, the plug has been pulled, and the last out has been recorded. And yes, the chickens have hatched and, for the most part, been counted. Why then do I feel as if we're just getting started? Here to weigh in on the just concluded 2024 session and or set the stage for the coming budget session are Brandon Smith, Statehouse Bureau Chief for Indiana Public Broadcasting and the host of Indiana Week in Review, Niki Kelly, Editor-in-Chief of the Indiana Capital Chronicle and a longtime panelist on that same show, and Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Indianapolis. Thank you all for being here, and I hope, Brandon, you realize the baseball fan that you are, I included that one cliche.
I appreciated that.
Just for you, so I know that was the price of admission for you. But let's go around once and give me a label. We're going to talk about vetoes. We're going to talk about that sort of drama that came after the gavel came down, sine die, because there was a little bit of drama in many ways surrounding the governor's actions. But before we do, looking back on the session, Brandon, let's start with you. Give me a label.
Well, I know Niki and I disagree a little bit on this.
That's good. That's what this is all about.
In that, lawmakers before the session said, "Oh, it's going to be quiet. We're not going to do that much. Small tweaks to existing policies,
fine-tuning."
And I think Rod Bray said it at the last night of session when I asked him about it, which was a lot more heavy lifting than he thought there was going to be. But I think you have a slightly different view on how the session went.
Yeah, I found it kind of boring. I mean, there were 2 or 3 sort of significant bills that were contentious and drawing some ire, but other than that, I thought it was mostly, sort of smaller, low-impact stuff. So.
That's why we have 3 guests, so we can have a tiebreaker.
Yeah.
It's all up to you, no pressure.
Well, I'm going to have to side with Brandon on this one, but I don't disagree with Niki. There were 2 or 3 really contentious issues. It just happened those were really contentious.
And they were very high profile, and they got national attention in many cases. The anti-Semitism bill certainly.
Absolutely,
for
and same in terms of Senate Bill 202 with regards to tenure and faculty. And I don't think these
notion of intellectual diversity on the college campus.
Yeah, you didn't necessarily have to have this. They could have had a nice, quiet session, right? That was a choice. And it might be one that they regret, but that was obviously what we had. Even though it was a short session, to me, it was fairly exciting, even if it was just a couple of issues that really took up most of the time.
Well, let's agree then. We'll come to terms that it was a session that started supposedly quietly, ended up with a lot of heavy lifting that turned out to be boring for some.
A loud whimper? Is that a loud
I'm just saying, if there's only 2 or 3 bills that are really causing the ruckus, that's not an exciting session.
What can we take away from leadership? Because, supermajorities, I've often said that heading a supermajority is not the easiest job in town. It may be the toughest job in town, certainly tougher, arguably, than being the head of the minority caucus when you only have a very small group to serve as the loyal opposition. The fact that it wasn't as quiet and as much fine-tuning as we thought what does that say about leadership? Now, there are 2 ways to look at that, I suppose. I'll answer my own question. One is they didn't read the room and they didn't anticipate how much pent-up demand there was for some of the special interest legislation. Or you could say, if you look at the bills that were filed, there are a lot of bills that never got a hearing that would have made the contentious bills we talked about look like chopped liver.
Well, but at the same time, I'd say if there's 2 or 3 really contentious or high-profile bills, it was certainly Senate Bill 202, but it was House Bill 1002, anti-Semitism, Senate Bill 1, reading. So, 2 of the biggest bills of the session were 2 of their top priorities. So leadership was saying one thing, but then they put, you said it a lot, John, early in the session when we were talking about this. Yeah, lawmakers said it would be quiet, and then they made one of the most controversial geopolitical conflicts in history, certainly one of the most hot button, House Bill 1002. So on the one hand, yes, they didn't do as much across the board.
Right.
But the big stuff, they didn't shy away from making those their priorities.
Would it have been without leadership? Would we have seen, we didn't get much attention, but there were additional abortion restrictions. We didn't see those get a hearing.
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff
and
that
that's
didn't get a
but for
hearing.
leadership?
We didn't have a fight over the word gender in the state. That
which
one
was
would have
another
been
bill
a
that
big
was
one.
certainly introduced.
And yeah, you mentioned and I'm conceding the 2 or 3 big bills, but
I think you're backing away from your earlier
I am
assessment.
not.
I think you're reaching. I think you're coming around to their point of view.
Usually we have 10 priority bills from them. We had 3 or 4 from each in the House and the Senate, and we had a lot of little skirmishes here and there.
Although I'll say maybe the most impactful bill of the session, and the one that could have had the greatest impact, also a Senate priority bill, didn't even make it past the first half of the session, which was the Senate bill that would have dramatically overhauled prior authorization in health insurance. That could have been, one of the most impactful things this legislature has ever done, and any legislature has done, in terms of health care costs and transparency.
And that would be a bill that seems to fly in the face of a prediction of a quiet session.
Absolutely.
Because that was anything but fine.
To almost prove Niki's point, which now I'm arguing against myself a little bit.
This is
but
such
to prove Niki's point,
it's a salon here we're having.
that would have not been made things quiet, but he couldn't even get past the Senate floor.
Is it, one of the bits of conventional wisdom is that these sessions, because of elections looming and primaries not too far away on the calendar, people want to get out of town and go back and campaign. My contention is, for a lot of lawmakers, this is the best free media they can get. And if they can come up with a proposal that they know isn't going to get so much as a hint of a hearing, still they can trumpet that. They can say, look, dear constituents, I fought this fight. How much of that was at play here?
I think a lot of it. This was pre-campaigning, and especially when we notice in Indiana, more of the competition is happening in our primary elections than the general election. Right now, it's the end of March. You've got a really short time frame before the election actually comes up, and especially with early voting, voters are making their decisions very soon. I think this is the opportunity for those legislators to really take a stake, especially on social issues, and when they're competing in the primary election, to be able to say, look, this is what I did, this is what I supported. I also always think it's a really effective campaign strategy to say, look, I introduced it. It didn't pass, but if you reelect me, right, next legislative session. And there is an aspect of legislative attrition. We've seen it here. Sunday alcohol sales, so many different things. Maybe the anti-Semitism bill reintroduced yet again next legislative session, where you make tweaks, your audience changes, the legislation changes, and eventually it doesn't pass one session, it might not pass the next session, but eventually it does get passed.
Well, and a lot of the most potent issues, it seems, tend to be when you get people no voter like an angry voter in terms of motivation.
Absolutely.
And it seems if there were an overarching theme, it's a lot of anti, fill in the blank this session, anti-regulation, anti-Indianapolis, let's not just stop at Indianapolis, anti-local government. Is that an statement of a lot of antis here? I mentioned regulation. We saw certainly child care regulations dialed back a little bit because there is a crisis, but, at the edges dialing back. Wetlands protections dialed back. More preemptions in terms of local government for the Gary gun lawsuit, which had been in the works for 25 years, pulling the plug on that, or puppy retail sales.
Well, but I mean, that's one way to frame them. If I put on my Republican hat for a second, I could say all of those things are not anti. They're pro. They're pro freedom. They're pro consumer. They're pro. It's dog sellers and consumers, and it's pro, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I mean, there's always the flip side to most of those things. The anti-Indianapolis one, I don't know what they're pro, but I think it's important to note though.
You're pro everything else.
Yeah,
is what I think the way it's framed,
apparently.
right?
But I will note on that though, we saw for the first time in a while, I would argue, Indianapolis really get a win here in that the legislature either came
an
up
11th
with
hour win. It didn't look good at some
It came
points.
up either with compromises in legislation itself when it comes to some of this stuff, like the downtown taxing unit.
Which they only a year ago they'd gotten the permission to use, right? The state.
Yeah,
the city of Indianapolis.
Turnaround. Yeah. But or they came up with compromise outside of legislation when it comes to the blue line, where there will be a mix of dedicated lanes versus not dedicated.
Which it's hard to construe that as anything. I know technically it would have involved the moratorium would have been involved other cities with mass transit, but as a practical matter, this was all about.
Well, and actually, as the legislation before it was shelved entirely, that legislation only applied to Indianapolis because of the concerns of other communities that, So again, I don't know how you say pro anything on that one, but on the others, there's always the flip side.
Is this always simply because it's a Democratic-controlled city? I mean, is that overly naive just to say it's as simple as that? The majorities in the House and Senate of Republicans
a lot
don't.
of that is, but you can see in the puppy mill sales bill, whatever you want to call it, depending on which side you're on, there were, Carmel counselors showing up saying, we passed this ordinance too.
21 communities, I think, had passed
and so
that.
it wasn't just Democrat on that one, certainly not. And so for the Indianapolis ones, I do think it's largely because the Republican supermajorities don't like what the Democrats are doing in the state's largest city. But for the other ones, it's a bit of a mix.
I will say that I think a lot of it is the political party aspect of it, but I think there's also a sense of lawmakers end up spending a lot of time in Indianapolis, and they go, well, I don't like that, and I don't like that, and I don't like that, so I'm going to do something about it.
I don't want to sit here and not be able to turn right on red.
Yeah, genuinely, we heard that from out of lawmakers' mouths was, well, why do I have to sit there at the light when there's nobody walking and there's no traffic coming?
It feels like there's a big difference, too, between Indianapolis and the rest of Indiana. When it's like Cleveland versus the world, I do feel like that it's such a large city in comparison to what is otherwise a very largely rural, with some obviously notable exceptions.
Well, in Indiana statute, it's defined as a first-class city, which sort of is a loaded term, I guess. You can read that as you want.
The only first-class city, right? They changed
Insert
that measure.
punchline here,
yes.
yes.
No, I think there is that natural attention. I don't know that it would matter if it was a Republican-dominated city and a Republican Supreme
I'm old enough to remember when it was a Republican-dominated city.
And there was still that conflict. So I think that tension might not just be partisan.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to watch in the future, because that seems to be one theme that, barring
never goes away.
A dramatic change in the makeup of the General Assembly or the makeup of city government, neither of which I'm guessing is going to happen soon.
Well, I mean, and in terms of talking about the future, I think the conversation about transportation in Indianapolis and the rest of Indiana is going to be a big theme in 2025.
Road funding and all.
Where Speaker Todd Houston is still banging the drum on. He wants the state to look at taking over the two big cross streets in Indianapolis, which is Washington and Meridian. And I talked to the House Transportation Committee chair briefly about that, Jim Pressel, and he's not quite on board with his speaker on that one. Because
funny how there's sometimes divisions within large
his argument is, of course, that if we take over two streets in Indianapolis, then every other community in the city is going to go, well, there's this big road that's important to the state. Why don't you take that away from us? And we don't have to worry about filling those potholes.
Well, as long as you're talking about road maintenance and who's going to control it. What about the police department and other things? I mean, we've had those discussions in the past. I promised a discussion about vetoes, and that did create some drama. and during the session. And it wasn't just at the end, like the wetlands bill, which dramatically scaled back a lot of the protections of those parcels of land, which we had already been dramatically reduced because of earlier legislation. But that doesn't mean there wasn't certainly a lot of people saying, knocking on the door, figuratively saying, please let that happen. Then we saw sort of a lull, as we often do, until the end, and that's when, a whole pile of bills shows up on the governor's desk, and that's when there was yet sort of the session after the session, where you have the same sorts of constituencies and coalitions that were there in place during the session sort of take a deep breath and say, here's our last chance to either, prevail or kill something or see something prevail. Certainly the surprise, well, I won't say it's a surprise, but the one that got the most attention, in part because it was the only veto, was the anti-Semitism.
Okay, I'm going to say, and I'm going to back you up in this. It was a little bit of a surprise before we talked to Eric Holcomb the week after session. So the Thursday after, so lawmakers wrapped up on Friday. The following Thursday, we went, the governor did a bill signing at a local bar in Indianapolis because happy hour is back in Indiana come July 1st for the first time since the mid-'80s. And so he wanted to celebrate that bill signing, but obviously we also got a chance to talk about the bills that were left out there that he had not decided on yet, or at least that he hadn't publicly decided on. And we talked about 2 or 3 or 4, and on almost all of them, he sounded like he was ready to sign them, and he ended up signing them. But boy, oh boy, it wasn't the first we realized something might be going on with that bill getting signed, but it was the first time where I think a lot of us were like, oh, this is really going to be getting
to your point, I mean, last week on this show, we had caucus leadership in, and Roderick Bray said, we reached this great compromise. And I said, are you sure there's no, it's pretty much.
All 4 legislative leaders.
Session ended,
so what happened?
It was
Take
huge.
us inside the behind closed doors.
And he says the compromise is crumbling, and all of us were like, it is? I mean, I think that was the general thing. And basically it sounds like they started hearing from people outside of Indiana, I think, and how we would look by not involving these contemporary examples that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance has. And I think he started seeing some pressure from that, and just maybe the compromise wasn't as good as possible. And also I think he realized that there were a number of states who had gone the proclamation or executive order route. And if that was going to satisfy people, then wow, we could have saved a lot of headache, right, during the session, because at the end he signs a proclamation and everyone, including the House who really wanted the bill, says, great, everything's great. And man, that could have saved us a lot of effort.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, he talked about in his message, filling the void. We don't want this. It's confusing language, could have unintended consequences in terms of harassment of Jewish students and so forth. But I'm going to fill the void. It doesn't. I mean, it has no practical bearing, does it? I mean, that proclamation?
No, not necessarily, but it does. It puts a
well,
standard.
The message.
The message matters, right? And even the law itself didn't have language in terms of what would happen if. So it was still the stand, I think. It's fascinating to me, like when you saw the House propose it, goes through no problem, the Senate guts it. It feels like there's a compromise and suddenly there isn't. Like you think of how you mentioned earlier, sometimes leading a supermajority isn't that easy. Like those are the entanglements within the party and then also those outside forces that I think really came into play in this one.
This was the governor's 8th and final veto. The others of those 7, 4 had been overridden. Right. 2 had been sustained, 1 never was brought up. Which category does this fall into?
Oh, I think they'll just. I think they just won't deal with it now. I think they're all.
Because
the House. The House. To your point, the House who was the champions of this in the General Assembly. They seem happy with the proclamation. The Senate, who really didn't want any piece of this thing, can now say, well, that's fine. The governor's taking care of it for us. So no, I don't think you'll see any hide nor hair of that again.
And if in fact the theory is right that he caved because of public perception from outside our borders, whether it's, talk about perception, that you won't be able to recruit people, it just is but didn't seem to resonate with him there. And you could probably find other bills, public access council are probably not a national issue, but still the optics of not doing away, with limiting the autonomy of the public access counselor who works on behalf of Hoosiers to say, hey, that piece of documentation, that probably is public record.
Or, if 2 members of a subcommittee decide to have a secret meeting in a coffee shop, that should have been an open meeting. You're making policy behind closed doors. But apparently some people have a problem with that.
Well, and that's one that wasn't really vetted throughout the whole session. That came up right at
God,
the
no.
end. So there arguably would have been reasons that the governor might have said, okay, that's something I can. Besides, I don't have to answer to anybody. I'm done. I'm a lame duck.
Look, that was an easy.
Why would he?
That was an easy veto for him on
So
public
what
access. Not
happened?
only were there policy questions, but the process was just a mess. And so I was a little shocked that he didn't veto that one,
That would
especially
have been
since he
your bet
waited
for
for it till the last minute. Like you said, he's got, it's his last session. He doesn't have anything to really be worried about or afraid about.
Yeah, he's not running for anything right away anyway.
Erring on the side of public access would have been the obvious choice on that. Obviously,
Hadn't he vetoed? I remember one of his, maybe his first veto was a bill dealing, if memory serves, with the price that the state can charge for
he could have
copying
easily
records
just
and
said,
accessing
you know what, if you
records.
guys think this is the right process or the right policy, let's go back, start it, do full vetting, and if that's what still comes out, then fine. But that's not what he did.
Or any surprises on the vetoes?
I'm not sure if there were surprises necessarily. I think the interesting thing, as we mentioned, like he's not running for anything immediately. That one I would have thought would have been eligible for veto, right? But again, this was supposed to be a short, easy session. And if you're standing from Holcomb's perspective, you're finishing out a lame duck term, right? You're trying to cement your legacy. I think he's had more surprising vetoes, especially in some of the previous decisions he's made, and some of those really contentious legislative sessions than what we necessarily saw here.
You can't think that he necessarily was worried about currying favor. I mean, he's already alienated a lot of the people. They're never going to warm to him. I mean, we saw that with the emergency powers. COVID's been gone. Well, it still lingers, but for the most part, as a public safety concern of the level it was, there's still a lot of ill will about the way he handled that and overreach. So what's his point of trying to be nice to these people now?
Yeah, not just, by the way, in the legislature, although because we saw, again, 3 years after we went through this entire session-long debate over emergency powers, there was litigation over some of that the legislature lost, and then it kind of went away, and now suddenly it's back again. They've come up with, I guess the governor thought it was okay, which is now, the governor can only declare a statewide emergency for, instead of 30 days at a time indefinitely, it's now 60 days at once, but you can't renew it unless the legislature comes in and says, sure, you can renew it. That seems...
That goes into the anti-category I was talking about earlier. Yeah.
But I mean, we're also hearing this on the campaign trail. I mean, these gubernatorial debates, the questions and even their statements, it's still a potent anger.
Well, you had his own lieutenant governor and his running mate, who was saying, this is basically full-throated support of this.
Suzanne Crouch definitely supported that. She tweeted out. I did want to note at the time when I read it, I was like, wow, I don't remember her requesting a special session publicly back then. I mean, she was lockstep with him then, but now she's obviously trying to separate herself
lot can happen
from those
in
decisions.
Indiana.
Campaign cycle?
I was going to say, all right, very much off script, but I like that. For those who watch Indiana Week in Review, that they'll indulge me in my little inside joke there. Let's look ahead, spiral forward. We talked about sort of the surprises, what sucked the oxygen out of the room in terms of publicity. When push comes to shove, and we look at next year's session, which legislative leadership is described as monumental. No lowering the bar like this year. We're lowering it. Next year we're raising the bar. Budget year is always a biggie anyway. What has the most lasting and profound impact of what was done this year, either done or not done this year, in terms of the upcoming session?
Oh, that's a great question. For budgeting, obviously the non-budgeting year, these were mostly social issues, but I do think you still see some of those social issues rise.
I think it's safe to say that social issues will be back.
They'll still be there, right? That felt like an easy answer, but we'll have a new governor, right? And not all the state legislators will return. Some of them will have challengers and will lose. There are some open seats. In terms of specific issue, I think it's a great question I'm not sure of, but I do think there's going to be a lot of revisiting of ideas.
And certainly
here.
we've already saw the sort of the pieces being set with an eye toward the budget. We saw that the $1 billion
That's
gap,
what I was going to say.
shortfall,
You want to talk about
of-
something that didn't happen this session that's going to be a big thing that happens next session is this Medicaid shortfall / attendant care issue where these families, a couple thousand families, we're talking about a couple thousand families who are at risk of losing the care that they desperately need for their medically complex children. And lawmakers threw their hands up in the air and said, well, it's fine. The agency rulemaking will take care of it, which is the first
Except
time
you can't have
that any
agency.
Republican lawmaker in this state
hate agency
has
rulemaking
said
unless
agency
it can
rulemaking
take the
is
heat.
the right way to go in a long time.
Well, and that was an optics question, too, because the parents of those disabled children who were receiving those benefits happened to say, let's show up when the celebration of the happy hour bill signing and say, okay, that's great, but what about
While I
us?
was a little thinking this one was boring, next year I'm so excited about. It's going to be fascinating on so many different levels. Obviously, the budget is one, and I don't think lawmakers are going to be able to avoid making real decisions on Medicaid. And yes, this was a shortfall, and they've covered it in the meantime, but the overarching question of how do we provide aid for our poor and disabled Hoosiers in a sustainable manner, because the percentage of the budget that Medicaid is eating up is growing and growing. So there are parts of Medicaid that are more optional than others, and so there's going to have to be some decisions made about whether we scale back some of those optional services.
I don't see any way lawmakers don't make cuts to the Medicaid
Yeah,
program.
they're going to have to.
Well, and Medicaid is so big now. You know, we always used to say it was almost just a Pavlovian response when you talk about the budget. Well, education makes up more than half of the budget. Now it doesn't. It's K through 12 is under 50%.
Just
largely
under, yeah.
because
And
of
then
these.
two other big topics that are going to be massive in a year when the budget and Medicaid are already big is road funding. We're still going through a study committee kind of thing to look at how we continue to fund our roads as gas tax revenue fluctuates. And then we've had this 2-year study of tax reform. And so
It has the potential to do some things.
So
yeah.
I agree when they use the word monumental. It's going to be massive. And not only should we cut taxes, but which taxes? How? Are there replacement dollars, or are we
Somebody
going to
gets
cut
hurt
the
every
budget?
cut, locals or
I
something.
will say this. I mean, there's so much to tackle in that session. There's so much to tackle. I'm starting to wonder if the tax cut thing is going to be relatively small. Like, they've taken 2 years and gone, and I think you could come out of it legitimately. And we've sat through those meetings. We've heard what all these experts have said, and the vast majority of them have said, your taxes are already pretty low.
A lot of taxes have already been cut
You need
and
money to
retooled.
provide services.
I mean, that's a great point.
And so I do wonder if that's going to be a little smaller, the outcome.
If so,
right.
that's a bad move because they've built this thing
they
up.
did.
Oh, you guys need a
years.
special session just to talk about this because we're out of time. And my nominee, K through 12, we spent 10 years trying to figure out school vouchers and school choice. So why not throw the whole thing out and have a system where the dollars follow all students, right?
ESAs, yeah.
All right.
There.
We'll see who's right, who's wrong. I know we are always going to be right. That's just the way these things work. Thank you. Again, my guests have been Brandon Smith of Indiana Public Broadcasting, Niki Kelly of the Indiana Capital Chronicle, and Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson of the University of Indianapolis. Well, that concludes another edition and another season of Indiana Lawmakers. I'm John Schwannis, and on behalf of commentator Ed Feigenbaum and a lot of extremely talented and dedicated professionals here at WFYI Public Media, including producer Scott McAllister and Eric Hartvig, director Brad McQueen, animator Sam Oliver, director of video content Kyle Travers, and the rest of our crew, I thank you for joining us, and I invite you to visit WFYI.org for more Statehouse news. Until next year, take care.